This Asian American woman is sick and tired of seeing how bad the Asian American community treats Black people, and she is literally airing out dirty laundry on how her own mother taught her how to be racist towards Black people.
Tell us what they be telling y'all at home that make y'all not like us so bad.
So you already know a lot of what my content covers, like racial triangulation, the model minority myth, Asian businesses in Black neighborhoods, affirmative action, and so on. As for what I was told in the home behind closed doors when I was growing up, that's not the most fun trip down memory lane, but I always like to be honest about acknowledging anti-Blackness among Asian Americans, especially when the call was coming from my own house, so here we go. I first became aware of my mom's anti-Blackness when I started kindergarten, and it mostly centered around avoiding interactions with Black people and not allowing me to be exposed to anything that she considered Black culture. So if we were walking and she saw a Black person, she would pull me closer to her. If we were in the car in a parking lot and saw a Black person in the parking lot, she would make a point to lock the doors, and I wasn't allowed to listen to rap or Michael Jackson or Tina Turner. And she was hypocritical about that, because I wasn't allowed to listen to Cyndi Lauper or Madonna either. She would call it trash music and say that it was going to be a bad influence, but if it was a white artist, it was not racialized. It was only when it was Black artists that it was racialized. And another thing that I think is kind of typical is, as a musician, there were a lot of Black artists whom she respected and enjoyed, but she would always say that one Black artist is the exception, the rest are bad influences. When I went to school, if I came home and said I made a friend, her first question would be white or Black, and that drove me nuts, because in preschool I dealt with a lot of bullying and discrimination because of being Asian, so it didn't make sense to me that she wanted me to turn around and do that very same thing to my Black classmates whom she knew nothing about on the basis of their skin color. And when I wouldn't stay away from my Black friends, she would resort to making up justifications as to why it was harmful for me. She would say they're going to hurt me and they're going to be a bad influence because they fight and they swear and they're not good students. And of course, none of that was true. And in my household, it was not physically or emotionally safe to voice your opinions, but about that I would, because it literally angered me. And then she would resort to physical violence. And that sealed the deal in my mind that prejudice is purely irrational, because none of her claims had any basis in reality, and that's why she had to resort to physical force. Unfortunately, I think that when parents resort to intimidation and violence to instill prejudice in their children, a lot of times it works. But I was very lucky, because the principal of my elementary school was a Black woman who implemented a program called Students Educating Each Other About Discrimination. And that wasn't centered on racial discrimination, it was about discrimination in general. But in that program, we learned to have discussions about discrimination and to identify it and disrupt it. Which at that age just means if you witness discrimination, say it's discrimination and articulate how you know that it's discrimination. So from learning that very powerful tool at school, I was able to identify that what my mom was doing at home was wrong. Additionally, the principal was a Black woman, so I had a Black woman in a position of leadership as a role model. And in my school district, she wasn't a token. They really valued Black leadership, from teachers to administration, guidance counselors, all the way up to superintendents. And so I was surrounded by Black role models who made me see that reality did not line up with what my mom was trying to teach me. The straw that broke the camel's back was sometime around the ages of between 7 and 9, I was planning a birthday party, and I told my mom that I want to invite my friend Keisha, which I knew was going to be an issue, but I thought I would try. And she said no, and I said, fine, then I don't want to have a birthday party, and she made me have the birthday party. So now that felt like that's not only cruel to me, but that's cruel to my friend Keisha, whom you don't even know because you refused to meet her. Shortly after that, we were walking in the mall, and my mom did this thing that she often did, which is she sees Black people minding their own business, and under her breath, she mumbles a derogatory term in Chinese for Black people. And I remember I pulled back on her hand and faced her, and I said, they are not doing anything. You don't know them. The next time you do that, I am going to go up to them, and I'm going to tell them what you said. And believe it or not, the fear of exposure by me actually made her tone it down, and she stopped doing that in public. Fortunately, my mom did not live and die that way. In later years, she came around to seeing and later openly admitting how wrong she was. In her older age, one of her best friends really was Black, and my mom admitted to her friend what her previous attitudes had been and why. And from those conversations, I was able to gain some insight as to what my mom's motivation was for her anti-Blackness. Because I think most people feel, since Asian Americans also are harmed by white supremacy, how does it make any sense for Asian Americans to be anti-Black? My mom spent most of her young life in Hong Kong when it was under British occupation, and then in the 1950s, she came to the United States when she was 16 years old. Generations before my mom, her family had been living in and doing business around Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Macau, which were French, British, and Portuguese occupied areas. So she was heavily indoctrinated into anti-Blackness in Hong Kong, where she had no exposure to Black people that would have shown her a different reality. And furthermore, what she was indoctrinated into is the idea that an Asian can elevate their status in white spaces by aligning with white supremacy, which includes aligning with anti-Blackness. So I think what my mom was doing with me is that from a young age, she saw that I was having a hard time as an Asian American assimilating. So she felt that if I associated with Black classmates, that would make assimilating into white spaces even harder. And she was concerned that associating with Black classmates would negatively impact my status in white spaces. Well, we all know with me that the outcome was I understand very clearly what spaces I want to be part of and what spaces I don't. So my mom was really proud that she was westernized. She was proud that she spoke English without an accent, that she was very well versed in European culture, and she actually looked down upon my dad for being what she called traditional and therefore backwards. Right, so where was my dad in all of this? My dad grew up in Taiwan, where he had no exposure to Black people, but he also had very little exposure to Western media. I think when he came to the United States, he was a bit uncertain around Black people because of the lack of familiarity and the slight media bias, but it only took a very little being around Black people to see that prejudice is irrational and that it serves a white supremacist agenda that he doesn't want to uphold. As I said before, in my household, it wasn't physically or emotionally safe to voice opinions that differed from my mom, so I do understand why my dad didn't speak up when my mom was being anti-Black. He had a hard enough time keeping my brother and I safe. However, what he would do is, when it was just my dad and I, he would make sure to teach me or give me resources about accurate Black history. So, for example, a lot of my mom's rhetoric surrounded musicians. So my dad would teach me about Berry Gordy, Chuck Berry, Marian Anderson, Jesse Norman. If the claim was that Black people don't value education, he would tell me about Black scholars, academics, and scientists, and so on. So that, in a nutshell, is what I was told at home behind closed doors when I was growing up. I find that a good way to help people who have a different lived experience than you exercise empathy for the struggles that you face that they may not be familiar with is to help them understand. And I was hoping that you could help me understand what anti-white racism looks like. Can you tell me about how you don't know where your ancestors came from because they were kidnapped and enslaved? Or how you don't know what languages they spoke, what spiritual practices they had, or what traditional knowledge that should have been your birthright was lost? Not because they were allowed to and wanted to assimilate, but because their enslavers or residential schools forced them to assimilate. Can you tell me about how your ancestors had explosives tied to them while they were building the United States railroads, and then as a show of appreciation, they were excluded from society for nearly 60 years? And could you tell me about the hundreds of towns that were destroyed, like the Black towns and Chinatowns and Japan towns, all destroyed by the same demographic? Can you tell me about the children who were unalived because they whistled at a woman or because they floated in a lake a little too far past the segregation line? And can you tell me how it was for your parents and your grandparents to be United States citizens who were put in internment camps on United States soil? Can you tell me how it was for your family to live in the back of their store because people who look like you were not allowed to purchase or rent homes? And could you tell me how it was for your parents and for you to shed blood, to be treated as human, as equal, and to be allowed to simply share the same space as other people? Can you tell me about the conversations that you have to have with your children about police interactions? And could you tell me about how your mother and your sisters and your daughters are concerned about having children because of lack of equitable access to healthcare, because doctors were told that people who look like you can't feel pain? Can you tell me how it feels to know that your ancestors lived here for thousands of years, but when you try to come here, you and your children are put in cages? And can you tell me how it felt when a few years ago the president entertained having people who look like you expelled from the country again? Can you tell me what anti-white racism looks like beyond having your feelings hurt, feeling uncomfortable, and having your sense of superiority challenged? And when you're done telling me what anti-white racism feels like for you, could you please tell me why you're not fighting to end racism for everybody? It took me a while to recognize the pattern in U.S. history of the United States recruiting immigrants to come and do work that they didn't want to pay black people to do. So immigrants arrive and they're taking these jobs and they see black people out of work and are told it's because they're lazy and they don't want to work, as opposed to being told the truth, which is the reason why you're here is because we don't want to give opportunities to black people, or that black people are not working because they're advocating for better working conditions, because it'll take newly arrived immigrants, particularly those who arrive as refugees and don't want to risk having to return to their countries of origin, a while to realize that their working conditions are poor and they're going to be mistreated as well. And that this history does go all the way back to just post-emancipation. Plantation owners recruited Chinese laborers to come and do the work that slaves used to do because they didn't want to have to pay former slaves for the work that they felt entitled to receive for free. And an interesting byproduct of that history is that Chinese laborers came and quickly found out that they don't like working in the field. And as poorly treated as they were by white people, they were afforded rights like the ability to open businesses and buy properties. So the former Chinese laborers opened up grocery stores catering to black people. So that's where that history of Asian American owned businesses operating in black communities came from. But my understanding is back then it was more symbiotic because these Chinese owned grocery stores charged significantly less than white plantation commissaries did. But it's interesting to me that people resist this idea that opportunities are kept from black people because we have in place a white wealth and power structure that doesn't want to pay for what it felt entitled to receive for free, when that's literally the history of it.
That was a lot. I mean, yes, even if I've read about American history, I constantly come here on YouTube and search about it. TikTok is more exposure for me as well. It's just like, it's the way she explains it, and you really tell that she has taken her precious time to learn about this information and history about black people, but it's just, it's just so heavy. Man, this is a very sad story because I went through her TikTok page, and literally her entire TikTok is about spreading awareness, the discrimination towards black people that's happening from the Asian community, how she has seen being an Asian American, realizing that African American people paved the way for them to live comfortably in America, that right now they kind of like more on top of the ladder than black people. But she grew up not knowing these things, and she grew up with biases about black people literally her entire life, because that is what was installed in her. And I think this is a very important lesson to learn, that actually we need to come to a realization of the reality is no one is born racist. Like, it is taught, and it starts within our schools, with households most importantly, because in African culture we say raise a child in a way that they must go. Charity begins at home. So it's a pity to see this, but let me know what you think in the comment section about this situation. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, but I think it's a privilege that we are living in an era right now where people are calling out their own people. I love that she's calling out the Asian community because it's still happening until today.